Welcome to the Homeschooling Free from Fear podcast with Caleb and Leah Schrader, where we encourage parents to homeschool without fear. Today, we're going to be talking about beginning our homeschool journey. In our first two episodes, we sort of shared our own homeschool background as homeschool graduates, but now we have 6 children, and we're about to graduate our first, and that started, seems like a whole long time ago, more than 12 years ago, when we very first began. So we want to talk today about sort of the process of deciding to homeschool and what it looked like in the early years. So Leah, my first question to you is, why did we decide to homeschool in the first place?
Well, I think one of our reasons for deciding to homeschool was because we thought it had gone really well for us. We realized when we got to college and kind of some of those insecurities that we'd had before college about whether we were prepared for life, and we got there and we saw, oh, yeah, actually, we're doing well. And that was something that we had insecurities and fears about as kids, but once we got out, we saw that homeschooling had worked really well for both of us. And so I think that was one of our big reasons. Another reason is we just loved our kids. We wanted to be with them. We wanted a lifestyle where we would be together as a family. And so that was a really good reason in my book. Also, for me personally, and I know this is true of you too, but I loved to teach. I thought that it was fun to teach my children. And that's not something that's necessarily true of all homeschool parents, but I think all parents in general love to see the light bulb go on for their children, love to see them learning and growing. And so that was something that was important to us, to me.
Yeah. When we began to sort of pursue that, I think that a lot of we really never expected to do anything else.
Yeah.
As homeschool graduates, that was our family culture. Both of us had families of origin that did homeschool. But something that really sort of aided me in that decision was being a public high school teacher. I started teaching in 2002, full-time in the public schools. Our first daughter was born in 2004. And, when we started her homeschool journey, I had already been in the public education system for a while. And I'm a student of education. I love studying education. And so a really big impetus for me was in education, we try to individualize instruction, and it's impossible.
Yeah.
You can't do that. For me, I'd be teaching classes. I was at a smaller rural school, so I'd have classes that were as small as 15 students in a class, up to 30 students. But 15 to 30 students, you cannot individualize. I would try to make a connection with my students every single day, but that was micro connections. And when you're homeschooling your own children, you have so much more love for them than a school teacher did. I mean, I love my students, but not like I love my children.
Yeah.
And that love for my students motivated me to try to make connections with them, but I couldn't pour into them like a homeschool parent can. And so I recognized that a homeschool model provides everything that a public school model or even a private school model just can't do because you have so many people in front of you. It provides the opportunity to individualize that instruction. So that was a big part of my motivation, was that we could individualize instruction with our own children.
Yeah. And we really, looking at it, we really have individualized our instruction with our children. Like, we've had some children who've had a lot more trouble reading than other children. Other children have had more trouble with math or spelling. So it's been a blessing to have that right from the start, where we could individualize it for whatever they needed.
Yeah. So we've always tried to individualize the instruction. We have sort of a theme of every child, every year, and it's not always going to be the same. We're not always going to use the same curriculum because I recognize the power of individualization. And I sort of shy away from curriculum. Even in the public schools, I would train teachers and I would say, the textbook doesn't teach the student, you do. But really the primary way that you teach students is by providing a rich learning environment. And it's so important that starts even when they're babies, even when they're tiny, And we did silly things with our oldest, Sophie, when she was little. I remember getting those baby Einstein videos and letting her listen to those. And they have like people speaking in different languages, and they have classical music. And I remember studying linguistics, and like I want her to be exposed to all these different phonemes, so she's heard them as a child. So if she wants to learn a foreign language when she's older, she can form those. So I had all these ideas for my own studying of child development, of what I wanted our children to have. I was sort of more academic with it, but you really sort of provided the fun aspect of that for our littles. So what was it like homeschooling in the early years, especially like preschool? What did that look like for our children?
Yeah, so it was important to me to provide a rich learning environment too. And for us, I think that looked like a ton of reading aloud. That was a very big theme throughout our kids from babyhood, really. And I think that my grandmother and my aunt, they were both, my aunt was a preschool teacher, and my grandmother just kind of understood providing like a lot of opportunities for children to do things like paint and play with Play-Doh and just do things that where they could explore their world in a tactile way, especially as little ones. We would do rice boxes and just different things like that. And that was something that I really enjoyed. I would tape watercolor paper to the table and let them watercolor while I was making dinner, or different things like that that just really allowed them to explore their world. And sometimes, that made a mess, but it was worth it. It really was.
Yeah. We were having a conversation recently because in those early years, I was a little overwhelmed. My sort of early homeschool experience was a lot more, I guess, sterile, if you will. And so I'd get home and there'd be like rice all over the place and, paint all over the place. And I'm just sort of like, what is going on? I can remember like we'd have sand and water and just the kids are just playing with all of these things. And you would just encourage me that, hey, this is gonna help them learn how to experience their world, how to express themselves, and now our oldest daughter is very successful in the arts. She's very creative. She's really thriving both with her music and with her graphic design and things like that. And so you said to me the other day, like, hey. Were all those messes worth it? And I can say it is. Yeah. So if any of you homeschool parents out there are like me, where you're like,
having a fear of the mess.
Yeah. I'm a little more, I need things a little bit cleaner. But a rich learning environment is not clean.
Well, and messes are always temporary. They can always be cleaned up. But you can't go back to provide a rich learning environment in a totally sterile. I mean, not that you didn't have a good rich learning environment, but it was different.
Yeah.
You were outside for your mess,
Part of that mess, though, too, is also willing to let the kids do tasks that maybe other parents wouldn't let their kids do, that it's going to be more messy. They're helping in the kitchen and they're learning to cook, and they're making big messes, right?
Yeah.
They're learning how to do things. We're not always stepping in and taking over. We're allowing them to sort of make some mistakes, make some messes, so they can learn from that.
Well, and it's just a physical representation of what you've always talked about with your math students, how you would practice not picking up their pencil. Of course, you could write the formula and have the exact steps to do their math problem perfectly, but that's not going to teach them as well as letting them hold the pencil and asking those questions that are going to help them. So I think it's just like a physical representation of that same idea.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, a lot of times we sort of want our kids, as soon as they have the abilities, to sort of jump in and, okay, now you're old enough and mature enough, so now you can start cooking. But if you're not letting them do it when they're younger and they're making messes, they're not going to want to do it when they're older.
Yeah.
Because when they're younger, it's fun.
Yeah.
Right? And so and then they gain those skills, and then they feel comfortable doing it later on.
Yeah.
And so you're establishing those sort of patterns early, while God has designed them to really be curious about how the world works.
How about you? How were you involved? I mean, other than cleaning up the messes.
Yeah. In the early years, I was getting started in my career, as soon as I finished college, I actually started working full-time while I was a senior in college. And then I started my credential program. And were having kids. I was a full-time coach. And I always had a lot of hats that I was wearing. I was doing ministry at the church, doing junior high ministry. And so I was going 100 miles per hour all the time. And I can remember when I would come home, I would just want to sort of check out. And I was really convicted that wasn't my role as the head of the household, as a leader in the family. I was giving sort of the sloppy seconds to my family. And where it was really convicting to me was with my running. I've always been very disciplined, and I can always make myself go further than I ever have before. I love running marathons, and usually about mile 20, I'll hit a wall, and I just force myself to power through, and the energy comes. And I realized I was coming home, and my littles, we had 4 under 4, and they would want daddy, and they'd be climbing on me, and I would just fall asleep on the couch. And I realized I can find energy to run 26 miles. I can find energy to play with my kids. And it literally, for me as a man, it was like going to a place in my head where I had the strength, I had the endurance in the race. Well, I should have that in life. And if it's not translating, I told myself, you're not allowed to run anymore if this doesn't translate into practical strength for your family. And so I started going the same place in my head I would go to when I'm running a marathon. When I get home, I can remember sitting in the driveway and thinking, okay, you feel like you've just, run 20 miles, but you got another 6 miles. Go in there and give your best to your family. And so I'd come home, and I would do things like reading with the kids, just sort of sitting and letting them all sit on my lap while I'd be reading to them. I would sit up we had a breakfast bar in our kitchen. I'd sit up at the breakfast bar so you could just visit with me, so we could have that connection, and you could sort of debrief. You're more of a verbal processor. So during those early years, figuring out, what we're doing, where we're going, you needed to talk about it. And so I needed to provide that space for you to be talking to me.
I also needed adult conversation.
Yeah. And I'm passionate about education, so I wanted to talk about it. But the key for me was sort of psyching myself out, saying, hey, you know what? Come home, be present. Be present when you're home. Be present with your children. Be present with your wife. Be available for conversation. Be available for connection with your children. And even figuring out ways to overlap my interest with my children. Like I said, I run. And so what I do sometimes is I take one of the kids out on their bike, and they would ride next to me while I was going for a run. Or we'd go over to the park, and I would run around the park while they're playing on the playground. And I'd figure out ways to sort of integrate family life into that. So it wasn't like I'm always doing my own thing and they're doing theirs. And almost integrating that, I think, gave them all sort of a passion for my passion. Because now, this last year, all 6 of our kids ran on my club cross-country team. And we didn't twist their arms. They wanted to be on Dad's team because they've seen me doing that for years. And so now they're excited about what I'm excited about.
Well, and it's a family thing that we've done together throughout the years. And so that's not new. That's something they've enjoyed the whole time.
Yeah.
Do you think there were any particular fears that we had at this time in our family life and in our journey with homeschooling?
My fear early in our homeschooling journey just sort of played into the differences between our homeschooling model and the one that I'd grown up with. And it's an interesting one because when I was growing up, my parents gave us lots of opportunities to connect with people outside of the home that weren't saved. I was on the Parks and Rec basketball team. I played Little League. I swam competitively during the summer. And so I had all sorts of friends who were not saved. And God also, from a very young age, He gave me a passion for evangelism. And so like when Awana would say, bring a friend, I had plenty of people that I could invite to come to Awana. Even just playing with our neighbor across the street. That's the very first person I ever shared the gospel with when I was a little kid. And so as we were sort of integrated in the homeschool community, it was so much larger than it was when I was a kid. And so when I was a kid, I had to have unsaved friends. I had to have friends even outside of the church. But our kids have a huge church. They have a huge homeschool community. And pretty much the people they interact with are all saved. And so I think a big fear for me with our children was, what if they don't have opportunities to evangelize, to reach out to people who don't know the gospel, to strangers, even people who are just not like them. I want them to learn to be hospitable. And for us, that means loving strangers well. So I had a fear because their environment was different, that they wouldn't just have the same passion for sharing the gospel with unsaved people. I was worried that they wouldn't be exposed to enough unsaved people and have opportunities to share the gospel with them. So that's a big fear that I had for our kids when they were little.
Yeah. I think one of my fears was that I would regularly talk myself down from was just that I wouldn't provide enough for our kids. And I think that's a mom fear that can come in lots of forms. And I think it comes for parents who are homeschooling and parents who are not homeschooling. Like, what if I'm not enough in these different areas for my children? And I think, for me, one of the comforts is that Jesus is enough, and he's the one who gave these kids to me, and so even if I won't be enough, I won't be a perfect mom to them, but Jesus will always be enough. And so if I can point them to him, then even if I didn't sit down for enough reading lessons, or even if I didn't, do a thorough enough job in our spelling curriculum, well, he's still enough. And so I would remember that. But then I also remembered the fact that there were plenty of areas that didn't get covered in my own homeschool as a child for me personally. And I could go into those areas and learn for myself because I'd become a learner. And so I think that was a really important thing to just be like reminding myself of. Both of those things, that Jesus is enough, and that if I train up learners, then they can learn whatever they want to learn. That's more important than them knowing everything that they should know at that time.
Yeah. Well, and one of the amazing things is like discipleship. It's not that there's a formula for it and like you're going to create this fully formed, fully discipled human who's totally mature and ready for everything. It's a process, and they're constantly in process. And I think for both of us, recognizing that that's a process that God is sovereign over, and that we get to be instruments and tools in his hands as he's using us. And so like even my fears of our kids not being evangelists because they're not around unbelievers, when they have opportunities around unbelievers, they totally reach out and they share the gospel, and they're courageous and they're friendly and they know God's word. So we've laid the foundation. And I think that's so important to understand that when you lay that foundation, then your kids have something to build off of. And you put those things in place, those basics, those essentials, and then they build off of those essentials. And as God is building them up into their head, into Jesus Christ, we get to just be his hands and feet in that process. And it's so important that we're just available to our children as we're investing in them. So we want to encourage you. Don't fear, be available to God, be gospel-minded in your homeschooling. And what I mean by that is view your opportunities, especially with your little ones, when you're correcting them, to bring the gospel into those conversations and establish them. And when they're grown, they'll stick with it. They'll hold on to it. Those messages that you shared them when they're young, they'll resonate all throughout their lives. So, homeschool, free from fear. Thank you so much for listening to us today.